Hi, Mako.
Hey, good to
It's
see
good
you.
to see you.
Yeah.
What are you working on?
Well, you can see this very large canvas. Lindsay, I don't know if you remember Lindsay, but she was my assistant, intern and assistant a long time ago, and she lives nearby. She's a mom of three now, but she comes in once in a while to help me, and she helped me to set this up. So ready to go. you know, always planning for your next steps.
Yeah, that's the thing that I don't know that everybody knows this about artists. Like, it's so many steps all at once,
hmm
everything. It's not just like, oh, here's an image.
Right. And it sometimes it's good to have these canvases out because your mind starts to work on them, even before you lay down your first stroke. Um, and you're always creating, even when I'm traveling, I'm uh, intuitively aware of my next steps. And so, yeah, but every time you face a blank canvas, you kind of get excited. You think about the potential of what it can become. So,
And that's part of the generativity of life in the arts, right?
hmm
I was recently looking through your
um,
refractions.
yeah,
Um, it's great that Nav Press just re-released the 15th anniversary edition.
yeah,
And in your essay on why art, you end it with this quote,
mm,
the path of apathy, the path of cynicism, or the path of the terrorists have
mm,
incarnated their realities in our backyards.
hmm hmm
To have hope is no longer an optimist escape.
mm,
It is the only path to the future.
mm.
And
Yeah,
I think art making image construction is that hope for the future, right?
yeah, and every word we speak, every action connected to what we intend to do in the world is actually all part of that power of what we say and what we do. And we don't realize that, when we are going about our ordinary days, but literally what we say on social media, for example, some casual comments or knee-jerk responses are projected and amplified into a wider world. So I feel like as artists, we are very, very aware of really the potential of what we paint and what we write, but also how they are received and how difficult it is to communicate. At the same time, the power of art is in projecting and creating the future, whether we know that or not. Um, and so I thought about that a lot, um, living and working and raising my children in Ground Zero, New York City, and realizing, well, the terrorists imagined flying those airplanes into those towers over and over. They literally imagined the future and they practiced upon it. They acted upon it and they executed it, unfortunately. So their imagination was used for terror. Um, the rescue workers, the fire workers who climbed up the falling towers, they also used imagination before it was actuated, before they ended up losing their lives for it. One to save lives, the other to destroy. So they're both acts of imagination. And I write in a book that we swim in the ecosystem of imagined actions. And so we are literally every day is acting upon certainly what we say and promise, that oath, in that sense of even public statements that we make actually have power. And if we want to live in a world that is filled with violence and hatred and divisions and wars, then our words will be filled with rancor and debasement and demonizing. But if we want to live in a world that is filled with abundance and beauty and goodness and truth, then we also have the power to do that today. And so, as artists, I think we are very keenly aware that what we say, what we do, a single stroke of paint actually can create the future.
Yeah. And I always think about the word abracadabra, right? As I create.
Yeah,
It's this
yeah,
ex nihilo
yeah,
creation,
right.
modeled on the creator.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. And you don't have to be necessarily religious to understand this. We teach this to our children. We live as if that was true. Although sometimes we're inconsistent in how we might play that out in our lives. And so when we think about the magic, of what we say and what we do, it's completely dependent on what we believe the future to be. Um, and the reality of what we imagine or we create, even fantasy, even these magic fairy tales, right? They seem to be divorced from reality, and we artists know that it's not. There's power in that, and therefore, what we believe and what we say and project has enormous implications in the world.
And something I've been thinking about in response to the last conversation that we had about stories and how we have this hope and this other future possibility, right? And how we construct a different story. But I've also been thinking about the concept of moral injury
Mm,
and the artist's role in a time of moral injury.
mm,
And how does the artist give us that glimpse, that imagining
mhm.
of something completely outside of that problematic paradigm? Because
Yeah.
even our
Mhm.
ancient stories
Mhm.
are rooted, grounded in harm.
Mhm. Yep.
So, how do we start telling something completely other?
Yeah, and these fairy tales are pretty, uh, pretty dark stories, and we wonder like what good is this for children? But really, part of art, first of all, is to depict what is the reality of darkness and trauma, and we have to be honest about that. The authentic experience is always not being afraid of what we experience, the injustice, as well as the common curse reality that we share, right? So that's number one is if we realize that the world is broken and um, in many places that there's we can certainly say that none of us, because we don't live in Eden, none of us can um, say that we haven't been oppressed, traumatized, persecuted in some way. But that's also an opportunity to communicate with each other, that we're not alone in that place of darkness. And artists, I think, are creatures who are prone to not only not ignore that fact, but also have the gift to articulate that in ways that can be understood, that can be felt, or lived into, so that experience is harnessed in some way. And that's certainly noble practice and ability of someone to do that well and to depict, in a sense, reality, honesty, um, and but at the same time, art has this capacity to look at our ground zeros and to see beyond them. And that's what I've tried to do is, you can run away from that reality or you can move into them. And I have determined that my call, at least, was to look at the devastation, this reality of the wasteland in front of me, and tragic realities and trauma, but to see through that in some way, to create something new that doesn't erase what is in front of you, but actually creates through it. And so, art fundamentally, and that's part of what I write about in Refractions. I'm literally writing those essays facing ground zero. So whether that's spelled out or not, it's in there. And I find myself, and I found myself again reflecting upon those essays, short essays. What a privilege it is to look back 15 years and be able to edit or add things that I see now more clearly. And I realized that as I had to believe that words have power, right? And what I write about, I had to believe myself, that, we don't have a choice faced with ground zero. Dr. King, the day before he was shot, in his mountaintop speech, he talked about this. It's no longer about uh, survival of, especially in a nuclear age. It's about existence or non-existence, right? And every poet, every artist, every dancer is moving into that reality to affirm life in some way, and to say that I have faced this and it's bleak, it's awful. I don't know how I will wake up next day and actually have hope. But we have learned in our bodies that if we show up in the studio, if we show up onto the stage, something kicks in, and we can, even our minds may struggle to believe, that hope, but somehow through our bodies we get this remembrance of what we have trained for. So that is, in a way, what I was reflecting upon, facing ground zero or going to places of devastation, and realizing places like Columbine High School, realizing that, that was the point in time where, you were frozen with fear and paralyzed, and you couldn't really sense any kind of hope. But looking back, speaking to the survivors and speaking to those who have determined to create the future, it's remarkable how artists can hear stories and experience in their lives something that we also long for and we also need to do what we do. We paint, we write, and there's something about that process that is moving beyond survival mode and living into what we talk about in culture care is, living into this generative life, not just sustainable life, but generative life, that grows into and blossoms a beautiful garden in ground zero. There's something that, um, despite what it is, and maybe because of what we see, we are creating something new.
And that reminds me of a story you tell about your father, um,
Yes.
and how he didn't uh, put a copyright on his work.
Right.
And it led to the development of the CAT scan. And
Yeah.
he did it so that research wouldn't be slowed down, so that there would
Right.
be more possibility in the world.
Right. He did not believe in copywriting. He was at Bell Labs, um, which sounds ludicrous. If you're a scientist this making these discoveries, he to this I only found out when he was in his 80s and went to this conference, and his students who are head of linguistics and speech and hearing sciences, gave a slideshow, and there was this X-beam research that he did when he was in postgraduate studies. It began around that time, and then that, because he didn't copyright it, was technology used to develop the CAT scan. And my father even looked very, as typical of him. He didn't even think about that was something he did. He saw it as a science. This is what science can do. When you develop something and you open source it, then many smart people out there will apply it and create something wonderful out of it. So why would you want to stop that? It's kind of the way he thought about it. And of course, my brother, the Silicon Valley entrepreneur, and I are like, incredulous, like, you know, but I think there's something very beautiful there that we can learn from, because art, what we do is principally a gift. It's not something that comes out of transactional reality. It can be part of that, and we can help each other to do that. But at the same time, its essence is in open sourcing our gifts, right? To share that with the world. And so, my father taught me that generosity is at the heart of generative thinking and living. And we really have to return to a place where art is leading the way in generosity, and somehow creating a language that pulls the transactional universe, the world, into a place of abundance, and where these things are freely shared, and people are able to benefit from small contributions perhaps that we make.
People are frequently saying, like, I don't want AI to just
Mm.
construct these images, right?
Hmm.
I want it to be able to, like, do my dishes.
Right.
And it's like, well, AI is constructing images right now because artists are at the leading edge of
Hmm.
exploration.
Hmm.
And they're the ones that have been, like, playing with the new thing.
Yes.
And so it's
Yeah.
showing another mechanism,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but it's also like there's possibility and responsibility.
Yeah.
And how do we navigate the generosity of the artist, right? Because the artist too needs to be supported.
Yeah. Right.
And there, so how do we navigate all of that in this ecosystem?
Yeah, and taken advantage of, right? We, uh, companies will take advantage of generosity of artists and never think, that going through many contracts with publishers and galleries, because there's no union for artists, the contracts are strictly from their perspective. The lawyer is saying, well, this clause has to be in to protect the company, right? But there's no artist perspective to say, but what about my copyright? What about the uniqueness of what I contribute? Um, and so it's entirely one-sided. We should know that going in. Um, and we can be taken advantage of because artists tend to be very open sourced and generous by heart. Many of us learn not to be because we have been hurt by abuses. But ultimately, you want to be in a place of trust and benefiting both the transactional reality and protecting the integrity of what we do. Um, so I think part of our journey through culture care is to find a way where we can at least create a template of some kind for artists to think about their craft being, in the transactional world. Now with AI, that has become, this kind of a steroid mutation of many influences and confluences. But what's amazing is that it's still anything humanly created uh, grows in ways that you don't expect, and that's already happening with AI. There are many types of from GPT to Claude to, but they're all different because they have different emphasis and they have different learning algorithms. And you're finding that the things that we least expect the machines to be able to do, which is to kind of tap into the mystery and beauty and nuance, some of the algorithms are capable of doing that in surprising ways, not in any way, in my mind, that is a threat to human being. It's just because we are the ones who have to recognize that and bring it into our domain. So it's still a tool, essentially. It has no agency or moral compass. So we are the ones who have to think through those things. But I find it fascinating. I find it really, really interesting. And the images that say from 5 years back of all the NFTs that came out, right? They look kind of silly now because our eyes been trained to see through them. And if they don't have the multiple capacity to retain an audience, which they don't, because flat one-dimensional thing, then it won't endure other than just gimmicky, flashy, this is a moment where this came out kind of a thing. And so in order to create embeddedness of these images, I think the human brain is going to evolve in a sense to discern. We will, it's training our eyes to discern what the machines cannot do. And for that, you really have to have this daily practice of gaining somatic knowledge. You really have to understand that, creating an omelet is hard, and it doesn't matter how much recipe you read, you just have to fail many times and try different things to create that very simple omelet. And in the same way, I think we're going to find that AI is going to increase our capacity for knowledge, certainly informational knowledge, but it's going to seem less and less magical, going back to that term.
Yeah.
And what we find magical actually is people like us who spend enormous amount of time in their studios and the stage backstage practicing what we know well, that our bodies have learned to pick up, to connect with our intuitive side, so that what we're actually doing is far more than what we know. It's basically um, moving into a dimension that we don't even fully understand ourselves. and and that journey is critical for AI development. So it's both and I think it's going to be very interesting in a few years, even when this initial euphoria dies down with AI, with everything, right? Internet came out and there was an internet bubble, and then it kind of burst, and then the real stuff remains, what we use today, that we benefit from. And so I wonder if this is going to be like a um, explosion of imagination. But it's going to require those of us who have access to somatic knowledge, as well as what understanding of creation of algorithm, and all that is, AI is going to kind of be the one to help us. But it's a fascinating time to live in.
And you're talking about the somatic knowledge and the importance of failure
Hmm.
and learning.
Hmm.
And I wonder if you could share an example, a few examples of times that you remember failing forward.
Yeah. Yeah, you see it right here everywhere. Remnants of failures. Well, first of all, you're painting and you're basically executing what you know, and you've done it thousands of times before. And it's never the same. It's never the same. And there's always surprise in front of you, like opening up, and you have to be sensitive to that. Like you have to let it go, because it's not like you can control, and the way I paint, I am actually accentuating that side of things. So I want things to happen that surprise me, and I am kind of going with the flow. It's more of jazz improv, than practiced uh, some piano playing, I guess, that is rehearsed and rehearsed. It's kind of so I am not only waiting, but I am delighted with mistakes and things that didn't go the way I thought. And my writing as well, it really is interesting looking back 15 years to when I first wrote Refractions and those essays, and um, things that jump out at me looking back are things that I didn't expect the essay to do or say. And they have this um, voice of its own that kind of takes over, and you're collaborating with it and you're trying to steward that, but ultimately it comes out of moments of realizing that, boy, this sentence really doesn't work, you know and but there's something beautiful about it. So you work with your editor and you say, well, I know this is the way you ought to say this, but is it possible to? and and good editors, would know, right? Like at the discernment and say, well, Marco, I don't think that's going to work. Or say, you know what, there's something here. Let's push this. And, you have to change other things to make it work, and so I'm always surprised. And because I invite imperfections and mistakes into part of what I do, I guess I'm not a good example of what like what would be an example of that. It's like every time I paint, so I, well, I know that for sure gardening has taught me that it's like 80% failures. You plant the seed and you think it's gonna do thing and it doesn't, and praise God, it's okay. And some other things will happen, and even weeds and things that I want to extract can't have meaning. So
So maybe the better question is, when did you learn to value that?
well, that's a good
Or
question. That's a good question. I think even as far back as, when you and I were walking around New York City together, trying to do these meetings and, encourage artists. And um, I was still in the process of coming to realize that, perfection as far as the goal of all this is not what I thought that would be. 9/11 had a devastating effect on that. You know, this brokenness, ground zero reality that I still carry with me. But it has, because I looked at the heart of darkness, right? Um, and I was forced to live there, but I see in my children this new resiliency and love toward the city. They all move back to the city. Why? Why would anybody want to live in New York City? Well, they have a different perspective because we saw what happened. The community that became so strong and intact. Their friendships with kids that grew up in that area, they just have a different attitude about the future. And so I think through those days, I've learned that there's so much more than what I can project or what I can create or what I can muster up, to make this even life um, that is ideal, or and we find that grace will permeate through the broken fissures, that somehow that's when it hurts the most, but that's when art can actually inhabit to illumine that, in a way that can resonate with people who are perhaps going through different things, and they bring their stories. And so I'm not the one completing that picture anyways. um, and so this has been a journey of learning and relearning that, and I am grateful for that.
so good. Thank you for sharing, Mako.
Yeah, so good, Julia. Thank you for this conversation. Yeah.
Yeah.